Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. We're doing a top 10 video today, which I'm excited about because I enjoy making lists like these. I'm kicking it off with a list of the top 10 IDW Transformers comics from the 2005 continuity. Of course, there are a lot of Transformers comics beyond IDW, not to mention that IDW published other Transformers comics outside of that continuity, and those are comics that I hope to take a look at another day in another video, but for now, I'm just focusing on the main 13-year stretch of continuity. For each entry on the list, I'll give a little bit of info about it and why I think it deserves a spot on the list. And 13 years is a pretty long time, so obviously there will be a lot that was left off the list. So if you're surprised that something didn't make the cut, it doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's garbage. It's just that these comics are what I consider to be the 10 best comics in this specific continuity. And believe me, it was almost painful to leave out some of these stories that I'd really actually enjoy. So this is my personal list. It's a very subjective list. This isn't a most popular list or a most beginner-friendly list or anything like that. These are just the comics that I think are the best IDW has to offer within their 2005 continuity. Cool? Cool. All right, so let's get cracking on this thing. Starting us off at number 10 is Megatron Origin. This 4-issue miniseries is set in Cybertron's distant past, before the war, showing Megatron's humble beginnings as a miner on the lunar outpost C-12, a facility under the autocratic rule of the Cybertronian Senate. After a violent outburst, Megatron's life takes a dramatic turn as he flees to Cybertron and becomes a prominent fighter in illegal gladiatorial death matches taking place in the underground of the city known as Kaon. This series takes us through Megatron's rise to power, the formation of the Decepticons, and the first uprising that would sow the seeds for the civil war between the Autobots and Decepticons. Alex Milne's artwork on this series retains all the ambition and impressive attention to detail that he would carry forward into his future work at IDW, particularly on More Than Meets the Eye, but there's an unmistakable edge and rawness to his work on this miniseries. The art is grim and gritty, and although it lacks the improved clarity of his later work, it perfectly sets the mood for what was one of the more politically and morally complex Transformers comic stories that had been told by that point in time. This series focused heavily on class structures within Cybertronian society, planting seeds that would bear fruit in the twin ongoing series in Phase 2, as well as greatly influencing James Roberts' take on Megatron and chaos theory and post-Dark Cybertron More Than Meets the Eye. This glimpse into pre-war Cybertronian society is still one of the best in the history of the franchise as far as I'm concerned. Rather than being some kind of golden age that was dashed by war, we see more of a Blade Runner type of dystopian world where the powerful wallow in excess, while those who have nothing to lose congregate in the criminal underworld, ready and willing to burn the whole thing down. Eric Holmes, the writer of Megatron Origin, never wrote anything else for Transformers before or after this 2007 miniseries, making it all the more remarkable that his single foray into Transformers comics produced one of the most influential stories in the entire IDW continuity. Coming in at number 9, Transformers Revelation. This 2008 miniseries and sequel to the Devastation series concludes the Asians era and ties off Simon Furman's plots surrounding Nemesis Prime, G-Axis, and the Dead Universe. Told across 4 spotlight issues, Cyclonus, Hardhead, Double Dealer, and Sideswipe, this series finds the Autobots stretched thin, trying to hold their own on multiple fronts and scrambling to find a way to stop Nemesis Prime from merging the Dead Universe with the, regular universe. On paper, it's the kind of cosmic, planet-hopping epic conclusion that was fully earned after years spent laying the foundations in previous issues. Unfortunately, in light of IDW's plans for a soft reboot with All Hail Megatron, Furman was only afforded these measly 4 issues to wrap everything up, which, needless to say, just wasn't enough space. Revelation feels rushed as a result, but still makes the list in spite of its hasty resolutions and other flaws, because the good certainly outweighs the bad, if you ask me, and most of the payoffs are all still intact. drawing from not only the previous series, but also things seeded in numerous Spotlight issues as well as the Stormbringer miniseries. Revelation was the culmination of what had come before, with the Dead Universe and Nemesis Prime bringing a fresh, unique existential threat to the table. And hey, Furman even finds a credible and story-relevant reason for the Autobot Pretender armor to exist, so kudos to him for that as well. What really elevates this series, though, is the stellar visuals. The artwork across these 4 issues is, in my opinion, among the best this phase of IDW's Transformers comics has to offer, with the highlights being Spotlight Hardhead by Roach and the phenomenally rendered Spotlight Sideswipe by Sue. Sue provides the coloring in that one, and the results speak for themselves. I haven't seen anything quite like it in Transformers comics before or since, which is unfortunate, but it does make Revelation that much more special. For number 8, we have Transformers Robots in Disguise issues 12 through 16. Issue 12 is titled City on Fire, and it would be an apt title for this whole arc. I appreciate John Barber's Transformers work more and more as time goes on, but early on I wasn't totally sold on Robots in Disguise. That changed by the time I got to this chunk of issues, where the scope and scale of the story Barber was telling became apparent and finally clicked with me. Once I got to this point in the story, I was hooked and was eagerly awaiting to see where Barber was going to take these characters next. After spending the first 11 issues and an annual following Bumblebee, Metalhawk, and Starscream trying to figure out the best way to restart post-war Cybertronian society, the first part of this simmering nation-building drama reached a massive climax that pulled back the curtain on a lot of the mysteries and questions that had been lingering and shook up the book in some pretty major ways. Megatron reappears, having been absent since the conclusion of Mike Costa's Chaos, and all hell breaks loose, with the Decepticons making a big push to take over Iacon. There's plenty of twists, secret schemes, double crosses, and general mayhem as everything slips out of Bumblebee's control and things fall apart big time. In these issues, Barber demonstrated that he wasn't afraid to take the book in wild, surprising directions, like suddenly killing off characters or turning Prowl into a component of Devastator. Those were the unexpected turns I was showing up for with the IDW comics, and this arc doesn't disappoint. Tying it all together is the art team of Andrew Griffith on pencils, with ink assists by Brian Shearer and Rick Ketchum, and colors by Josh Perez. Griffith's art on these formative years of Robots in Disguise has grown on me over time as well, and I more fully appreciate how stylistically unique his artwork is in the stable of great Transformers artists. Griffith's sense of scale and dramatic framing is, I think, a great match for Barber's scripts, and he brings the visual component of Megatron's attempted coup to life with style and flair. Moving on, the number 7 spot on this list goes to Sins of the Wreckers. This 5-issue series came out in late 2015, roughly 5 years after the massively popular Last Stand of the Wreckers. Last Stand had so much acclaim behind it that it wasn't hard to imagine that any attempt at a follow-up would be destined to fail. However, not only did this sequel not fail, but it was, in some respects, a much better comic than the one that preceded it. I guess that's my hot take of the day, because I don't know if anybody else feels as positively about this series as I do, but I do hold Sins of the Wreckers in very high esteem. I'll concede that the appeal is potentially much narrower. All things considered, Sins is kind of an odd one, but that just makes it more endearing to me. It's all subjective, of course, but there are just components of this story that are more impactful for me personally, in terms of my personal taste. I think Roach's artwork is stronger here, and in some ways, the narrative is as well. There's a different kind of tone to the overall story in Sins of the Wreckers that I find pretty compelling. It's one that seems much more introspective to me. We were deep into Phase 2 by the time the first issue of this series came out, and the world of Transformers comics had changed pretty drastically since we last saw the Wreckers during the Costa run. The war is over, and the remnants of the Wreckers drift aimlessly between small conflicts, struggling to find a place in a world that has fewer and fewer uses for their brand of extreme action. That all changes with the reemergence of Verity Carlo and the disappearance of Prowl, drawing the Wreckers and a few unfortunate Wreckers-adjacent characters into a bizarre plot of revenge and obsession. Nick Roach turns in some of the finest pages of his already impressive and notable career in Transformers comics, and it's all brought to life with Josh Burcham's superbly textured color work, as well as an assist by another wonderful colorist, Joanna LaFuente. Much like its predecessor, Sins of the Wreckers tosses a handful of lesser-known Transformers characters into the mix. In a story featuring the likes of Prowl, RC, Springer, and Cup, getting to see the likes of Stakeout, Carnivac, Hubcap, Overbite, as well as a sprinkling of Beast Wars characters and Tidal Wave from Armada is quite a draw. And yes, that's right, Springer, arguably the most underutilized big-name character in the whole IDW continuity, makes his long-awaited return in this series. Or at least long-awaited by me, big Springer fan over here. You don't want to get too attached to anybody, though, because just like its predecessor, Sins of the Wreckers will kill off a good portion of its cast before the story wraps. And there's some real emotional heft to a lot of it. The overall storytelling package just feels more mature, more refined, and much more character-driven. I think the relationships between the various characters have much more meat on the bone than in the previous outing. From the sincerely poignant to the disconcertingly creepy and everything in between, a major strength of Sins of the Wreckers is how well defined each of these relationships turn out to be, resulting in a series that I find extremely memorable, despite it understandably living in the shadow of its predecessor. Coming in at number 6 is Transformers Autocracy. This is the first of what would become a trilogy with this creative team, consisting of artist Livio Ramondelli and writers Chris Metzen and Flint Dille, which Dille's name should be familiar as he was a writer on the original animated show as well as the animated movie. And although the follow-up miniseries Monstrosity and Primacy are both great in their own way, Autocracy is still my favorite of the bunch. A big reason for that is because this first part of the trilogy is the origin of IDW Optimus Prime. Like Megatron Origin, Autocracy is set prior to the Cybertronian Civil War, and the planet is still under the rule of the authoritarian Senate, who have installed a ruthless, despotic Prime named Zeta Prime to crush the Decepticon insurgency. Optimus is still only Orion Pax, a hotshot officer who is frankly not at his best when the series begins. He's growing more disillusioned and cynical with the corrupt system he serves, channeling all that frustration in the wrong direction. For example, during a raid that kicks off the opening chapter, Pax nearly beats Swindle to death in front of a crowd of onlookers. The decision to start Pax in a deeply flawed and imperfect place pays off with a rewarding journey where the character goes from jaded cop to the Optimus Prime we all know and love. There are also callbacks and quotes galore, specifically some of those greatest hits from the animated movie. You could argue that it's a bit too much at times, but considering how much Dille has contributed to the original G1 lore, I think he's earned a bit of leeway. Ramondelli's unique art style depicts a dark and seedy Cybertron, a world filled with violence, oppression, and seemingly endless night. It's a striking visual style and a fitting complement to the gritty story of a squad of Autobots trying to do the right thing in a world choked by bloodthirsty dictators and violent terrorists. I know Ramondelli's art isn't for everyone, but it's definitely for me, and it's a humongous part of what makes Autocracy such an enjoyable read. Onward to number 5. This slot goes to More Than Meets the Eye, issues number 4 and 5. This is a two-part story centered primarily around Ratchet, though plenty of new and returning characters pop up throughout. The main thrust behind these issues is that a mysterious plague has suddenly broken out at Delphi, an Autobot medical center on the icy world of Mesitine. This pair of issues from the early months of More Than Meets the Eye contain pretty much everything I loved about this series, distilled into a neat little horror story with a relatively small cast of characters. There's quite a bit of intricate world building in these issues, the kind that I often associate with this title. Some that was added just for flavor, some to plant seeds for payoffs in future issues. There's also a characteristically bonkers sci-fi component here, where the rust plague wreaking havoc at Delphi was triggered by a sound bomb. It's pretty wild stuff, but everything here, the concept, the lore, the characters, the callbacks to Last Stand of the Wreckers, it all hits the right notes for me, to say nothing of Alex Milne's amazing artwork. The facility of Delphi is loaded to the gills with chunky, meticulously panel-lined sci-fi details that conveys an immersive sense of place that very few Transformers artists can match. This two-parter also introduces us to Pharma, who, although undoubtedly not as popular as another Milne co-creation, Tarn, is just as well designed, not to mention quite significant to the longer-running story of More Than Meets the Eye and Lost Light. In my opinion, this is among the best work of the entire series by Milne and Roberts. Reading it for the first time, I felt like I was on the precipice of a whole new world of Transformers fiction, one that was more fleshed out and complex visually and conceptually than anything else I'd read up to that point. Reading it now, even after the series is over, still takes me back to that point in time when the series was all mystery and potential, sparking my imagination and sense of wonder at how much world building was being stuffed into these pages. Number 4 on this list brings us to Transformers Escalation. This aptly titled sequel to Infiltration ramps up the pace considerably compared to its predecessor. With Megatron reasserting his command over the Decepticon outposts on Earth, he begins overseeing a campaign to destabilize human civilization, thus weakening it to the point of collapse so the planet can be more easily conquered and stripped of its natural resources. This process takes the Decepticons to the fictional nation of Brosnia, where Megatron begins orchestrating an international incident from the shadows. Optimus has arrived on Earth to assume command of the Autobot unit stationed there, leading a strike team to Brosnia to attempt to stymie the Decepticon efforts. However, the Autobots also have to contend with a new threat, the Machination, who launch a highly coordinated attack on Sunstreaker and Hunter in the opening issue. I love this series, and E.J. Sue's art is a big part of that. From the icy setting of Brosnia to the way character movement is rendered, Sue does not disappoint. Furman's no slouch on this series either. While I liked the slow burn of Infiltration, there's just no denying that seeing the Autobots and Decepticons come to blows more directly and for a more sustained period of time is immensely gratifying. The series is just pure nostalgic bliss, thanks in no small part to the best one-on-one fight between Optimus Prime and Megatron this side of the 1986 movie. A large portion of the 5th issue is devoted to the two faction commanders wailing on each other, and the fact that it's as successfully executed as it is speaks to how expressive and dynamic and capable Sue is with his artwork. This is the series where it feels like IDW's Transformers Ongoing is finally off to the races, featuring much more action and giving more page time to a growing cast of Transformers. But for those like me who happen to like the human characters and the slow burn of Infiltration, there's a pretty solid B-plot running through Escalation, focusing on Ironhide and human allies Verity Carlo and Jimmy Pink as they attempt to unravel the mystery of the Machination. Number 3, Last Stand of the Wreckers. As I said earlier, in some ways, I think Sins of the Wreckers is a better comic than this series. But I rank Last Stand higher on my list because there are things that set this book apart from Sins of the Wreckers and end up giving it a significant edge over the sequel series. Part of that is down to the simple reason that Last Stand came out first. It was a surprising and unexpected story that was sorely needed during the early days of the cost to run. And that's a situation that's just hard to replicate. Part of it is also down to the color work. As much as I dig the subdued color palette of Sins of the Wreckers, there's an eye candy element to Last Stand's vibrant and bright colors, again done by Josh Burcham with an assist by Joanna Lafuente. But the biggest reason why I rank Last Stand of the Wreckers higher than Sins of the Wreckers? Overlord. In 5 issues, this series cemented Overlord, a character I was barely aware of before this, as my favorite villain of the entire IDW continuity. Ridiculously powerful, nigh on unstoppable, and harboring an all-consuming obsession with delivering a beatdown to his former boss, Overlord completely stole the show here. There were no moral complications, no tragic backstory, no shades of gray, no redeemable traits to him. He was just a straight-up, completely evil dude. Overlord was the perfect villain for Last Stand of the Wreckers, seizing control of Autobot Penitentiary Garrus 9 and turning it into a twisted shrine to violence and depravity, all to draw Megatron's attention for a final showdown. Instead, He got the Wreckers, a team consisting of a good chunk of the characters you'd expect to see here, along with a heaping of nobodies serving as the newest recruits. Impressively, Last Stand makes you care about these nobodies. This becomes their story as they fight to survive in the madhouse that Garrus 9 has become long enough to complete their mission. James Roberts and Nick Roach ably balanced humor and pathos with a surprising amount of ultra-violence and death thrown in for good measure, making Last Stand of the Wreckers one of the most unforgettable Transformers stories ever published. Alright, moving on to number 2. Here we've got a 3-part story titled Shadow Play, published as issues 9 through 11 in More Than Meets the Eye. In general, Phase 2 of the 05 IDW continuity greatly expanded on the pre-war history of Cybertronian society established in the Megatron Origin miniseries. But Shadow Play fleshed out this pre-war civilization more deeply than anything else had at the time, making the world that these characters inhabit feel truly alive. There's a rich and dense Cybertronian culture on display here, one filled with societal unrest, activist groups, drug overdoses, body tourism, a school for gifted Cybertronian youngsters, not to mention authoritarian oppression and political intrigue. Mountains of political intrigue, to be precise. At its core, Shadow Play is a political thriller that sees its cast unraveling the tangled threads of a wide-reaching government conspiracy to exert control over Cybertronian civilization that builds to a Mission Impossible-esque heist, but ultimately culminates in a shocking twist involving the concepts of shadow play and imperata, brainwashing and bodily mutilation, respectively. Writer James Roberts, artist Alex Milne, and colorist Josh Burcham are all in top form here, producing a world that, honestly, I wish had been made into its own ongoing series with this creative team. Together, Milne and Burcham provide visuals that are somehow even more evocative of 80s and 90s anime than usual. It takes me back to the kind that I saw when I was younger, where there was a general feeling that maybe I wasn't supposed to be watching this, and I didn't know what kind of wild stuff I might see. Shadow Play's nostalgic After Dark anime feel is reminiscent of the Dreamwave style, only cranked up to 11, thanks no doubt to advancing digital tools, as well as improving technical proficiency among the art team. But to file Shadow Play away as pure nostalgia bait does a disservice to how modern and contemporary it actually is, in both story and visuals, specifically for Transformers comics and the medium of comics in general. To me, it's the perfect fusion of the old and the new, and that's a big part of why it's one of my all-time favorite Transformers comics and why it rates so highly on my list. And that takes us to number 1, the comic I consider to be the best IDW comic in the 05 continuity. And my number 1 is Transformers Stormbringer. War Within from Dreamwave holds a special place in the hearts of many, myself included, but if I'm being totally honest, I don't think it represents the Furman-Figueroa partnership at its best. That distinction belongs to Stormbringer. This 4-issue miniseries finds Jetfire and the Technobots stumbling onto a plot by Bludgeon and some of the other Decepticon pretenders to revive Thunderwing, who was once a Decepticon scientist before losing control of his mind and becoming an unyielding killing machine after bonding himself to his near-invincible Pretender shell. This was the first epic struggle against a world-ending threat that the Autobots faced in the IDW continuity, with Optimus Prime and the Wreckers joining the fray to try and stop Thunderwing. There's quite a bit to love about this series. For one, it reimagines the whole Pretender concept and explores it in such a way that makes more sense than it ever did in the Marvel comic or the G1 toy line. And that right there leads into something else that I'm a big fan of, namely using some of the less obvious household names from the latter era of the franchise, like Searchlight, Dogfight, the Technobots, and of course the Decepticon Pretenders. Also, as you can no doubt see, the art is gorgeous. I'd go so far as to say that it's some of the best Transformers art that's ever been done. Period. Figueroa renders his characters big and boxy with copious amounts of panel lines and details. I feel like this is becoming a recurring theme for me in terms of my artistic preferences, but Stormbringer's art style brings to mind the hyper-detailed approach of anime from the 80s and 90s, a perfect stylistic counterpart to the darker and more mature tone and story. There's another recurring motif here. If you look at some of my selections on this list, you might see that there are some underlying similarities to the stories. Stylistic and tonal choices that really land for me when it comes to Transformers comics and also stories in general. And for a chunk of them, it's the blending of science fiction and horror, something that the others on my list that do this do very well, but Stormbringer does the best, in my opinion. A post-apocalyptic world visited by an isolated science crew, a creepy cult comprised of a splinter group of Decepticons hoping to usher in a galactic reckoning, a well-intentioned scientist transformed into an unstoppable engine of death, all that plus Optimus Prime and the Wreckers. What more could you want? This one takes the top spot for me because it strikes a perfect balance between what I loved about Transformers as a kid and what I want to see in Transformers comics as an adult. There's something about Stormbringer that I can't put my finger on. The tone, maybe, whatever it is. It reminds me of all the best parts of the G1 fiction, but updated for modern sensibilities. It just really gels with what I want to see in Transformers comics, and that's why it takes the #1 spot. And that just about does it for this video. Again, this list is very subjective, but these are the stories that I think are the cream of the crop in terms of IDW's 05 continuity. And it wasn't easy to pare down my list to just 10, because there are definitely stories that I really, really like that didn't make the cut here. But it was fun to do it, and I was grateful I had so much material to choose from. It would have been much harder, if not impossible, to make a similar list for the Dreamwave comics and some of the other short-lived Transformers comics continuities. I think there's enough here in the IDW continuity that there's something for almost any Transformers fan. And I'm sure your list doesn't look like mine. So let me know what you think of my list, and let me know what your favorite stories are in this continuity. Whether you agree or disagree with my list, have other things that you'd rather see, let me know. Anyway, thanks for watching. It's much appreciated. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, like, and so forth. And take care. I'll see you next time.